Every country, every nation, and every city have their own calling. When Peter the Tsar conceived the idea to build St. Petersburg, all he knew was that he wanted to build a new capital city, a window to Europe, a city where people of various confessions and walks of life would live in peace and safety. The initial name of the city, a draft version, was Andreyevsk. Peter the Tsar wanted to commemorate the name of the Apostle Andrew because he was called the Apostle of Russia. Andrew supposedly reached the Kievan Rus, and so he was called the Apostle of the Slavs. But after Peter had visited Holland and seen peaceful coexistence of various confessions there, Catholics, Lutherans, and Protestants, he decided to name the city after the Apostle Peter, who is believed to be the protector of Rome. Thus, Peter wanted to demonstrate that our country wanted to establish a relationship with Europe. We were not just cutting a window to Europe, but we were also going to have peaceful relationship among the denominations. Thus, a new and final version of the city name was St. Petersburg. Saint means that Peter was not building the city to make a name for himself, but to commemorate the name of the Apostle Peter. St. Petersburg in the middle of the 19th century was a lustrous capital city which astonished with splendor of its palaces, residences and mansions. Their grand halls were the center of social life of St. Petersburg. Foreign celebrities frequented these places and the brightest intellects of Russia discussed important world events here. New ideas easily take root here, contrary to the traditional Russia. One of such centers of social life was the house of a splendid beauty, Elizaveta Church. Even Emperor Alexander II himself frequented her place. This woman laid the foundation to the great revival in St. Petersburg. She was the daughter of a hero of the patriotic war, Chertkova Elizaveta Ivanovna, and this boy is her son Misha, who is soon to die. He was brought up by a Protestant teacher who instilled in him love for and faith in Jesus. The boy said to her, "Mom, just believe in Jesus and we will meet again." And he shared with her about his experience of Jesus, how he felt him, and how loving and kind Jesus was. He was a child who was able to experience it. The boy died in 1874, and the broken-hearted mother started to wander from one church to another. Of course, she went to the Orthodox Church first, in order to cry, but she couldn't find any comfort there. She was only told that she had to endure. Then she traveled to Rome to the Catholic Church, but instead of finding comfort, she found disappointment. She felt that the priests were ready to say anything in order to comfort her. So she decided to close this issue once and for all and to stop searching. Elizaveta Church left her secular life in St. Petersburg and went to Paris. but balls and receptions were going non-stop in houses of Russian aristocrats there. The nobles had a new interest: philosophic conversations and debates, and meetings with preachers of the gospel, which was quite unusual for Russia. In 1860s, materialistic ideas were spreading in the Russian society in the form of a movement called Nihilism. You may remember such an example of a nihilist named Bazarov in Ivan Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons. Nihilism was quite a mass phenomenon of that time, when intellectuals generally lost their faith in God. But at the same time, the people's need, the need of the human soul for God, was preserved at all times. He was a favorite of the upper-class society and a son of brilliant admirals of the British Navy. After graduating from Oxford, Lord Redstock was supposed to make an excellent military career, but destiny had other plans for him. Young Redstock went to the Crimean War, where he fell severely ill almost immediately. The army doctors were helpless. Redstock, young and healthy as a bull, was fading away. On the brink of death, he heard the good news. One of the paramedics, seeing that Redstock was virtually dying, asked him, "Do you know Jesus? What is your relationship with Jesus Christ?" Redstock pondered because he considered himself a Christian and then said, "Is it possible to have a relationship with him?" The paramedic replied, "Yes, it's possible. He's alive and you can call onto him. If you want, I can help you." And that young paramedic helped Redstock to pray a prayer of repentance, thinking that he would die soon. But Redstock survived. Lord Redstock returned home a different man. His talent, good health, and a sizable fortune allowed him to completely devote himself to missionary activity. Having changed his attitude to Christianity, he was dreaming of going back to Russia, not with a weapon, but with the Bible in his hands. As a frequent guest at the balls and receptions, one day Lord Redstock visited a Russian noblewoman whose house was home for Elizaveta Church at that time. Chertkova was at her friend's place, who told her that a preacher would come soon and that she'd better wait for him. Chertkova sharply replied, "I'm fed up with all sorts of preachers. When is he coming?" Her friend said that he would come at 3 o'clock. "I'm leaving at 2:30 then," she said. She was about to leave when Lord Redstock suddenly came. He always came on time, but he arrived earlier that day. He always carried New Testaments with him and gave them away. And he always walked. He had special shoes with a thick sole. He had a thick, woolen, waterproof coat. His pockets were filled with books, but on that day he took a cab because he had twisted his foot. So when he entered the lobby and saw the stranger, he didn't greet her, as was his custom, but asked, "Are you saved?" Chertkova flinched and asked, "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that Jesus saves." And he started talking about Jesus, who is the same both in the past and at present. She was standing there crying. Suddenly, she heard the same words that her son had told her back in the day. She saw his eyes and his heart. His image immediately stood right in front of her, and she could not look at Redstock with indifference. She said, "I not only want to hear it, but I want you to come to us, because people in St. Petersburg should hear it as well." Redstock was a desired guest everywhere. He was popular. If someone didn't hear his sermon, it meant that he missed something important. It was like attending a new show. All who attended those meetings were astounded. Imagine a doorkeeper who, instead of preventing people from entering, invited them to come in. All the maids, cooks, and coachmen were becoming evangelists and invited visitors. Some at the market while buying groceries, some among other coachmen. They invited people everywhere. That's why the audience was very mixed. Aristocrats, along with stablemen and people from taverns. They were sitting side by side in velvet chairs in a malachite guest room, listening to sermons. During the first months after Redstock's arrival, some of the most prominent people of the time came to faith in Jesus. We'll mention three of them. Earl Modest Korff, who belonged to the family of the emperor's confidant. Earl Alexei Bobrinsky, who at the moment was the Secretary of Railroads, a high-ranking official, and a retired guard, Colonel Vasily Pashkov. Vasily Pashkov was the husband of Elizaveta Church's sister. He had 18 estates in 9 provinces: Nizhny Novgorod, Orenburg, Tver, Tambov, Moscow, and others. Besides the house on Gagarinskaya embankment, Pashkov had 4 palaces in St. Petersburg and a mansion in Moscow. Number 6 of the most influential landlords in Russia, Pashkov was on his way to become a minister and take an office at the Imperial Council. He was fond of hunting and secular entertainment. Lord Redstock was invited to Pashkov's house. After listening to him once, Pashkov said to his wife, "Why do you listen to this babble?" And when everyone knelt down to pray, he left the room and went to his bedroom. But he couldn't stay there. He also knelt down, and the Lord surrounded him with His presence. He testified that it was as though a ray of light from heaven penetrated his heart. And I saw the depths of evil in my heart. I saw that I'm a sinner who was completely lost, damned before the great throne of God. I stood before God and I had nothing to say. Within a very short time, he abandoned all his secular activities. His goal was now to study and to preach the gospel. And he devoted all of his talent and his wealth to this one goal. St. Petersburg was the capital city, and people came here to resolve their issues or to simply look around. And all of them ended up visiting either the house of Pashkov, Levin, Countess Shuvalova, or Bobrinsky. They ended up hearing sermons. Pashkov always asked who those people were and where they came from. He wrote down their addresses and then sent them books. He sent dozens of pounds of books, not just a few of them. That's an interesting fact. One day, Yefim Lashkov came from Belarus to visit St. Petersburg. And of course, he attended a meeting. Pashkov came up to him, asked his address, and later sent him a big package. Lashkov was from the city of Gomel. He was at home one day when his brother, who worked as a guard at the post office, saw a big package that arrived for his brother and inquired about it. It was for his brother, after all. He saw an enclosed letter and opened it as a brother. And then, full of indignation, he asked his brother, "Tell me, why does Colonel Pashkov call you a beloved brother? What kind of secret is that? God couldn't have his saved child be quiet about it." And through his whole situation with this package, he made Yefim confess to his brother and share about his newly gained faith and about a soon-to-be Christian community in Gomel. The wealthy people understood soon that it was not enough just to preach the word to the poor. The princesses established a sewing society where expensive clothes, as well as underwear and wedding garments, were made by the hands of common women. The women received wages and had an opportunity to work. The princesses visited them when they got sick and taught sewing to their daughters so that the latter could also work. The workshops were in different parts of the city, and noble women were in charge of each shop. One of them was run by Elizaveta Church, another was run by Princess Vera Fedorovna Gagarina, and one more by Elena Korf, the wife of Modest Korf. I've always been curious how they managed to find those poor women. Did they somehow advertise that they were looking for those who knew how to use a sewing machine, or how? You know, a historian is also an archaeologist. You dig here and there, you pull out information, take a closer look at what you have dug out, you know what I mean? And in some book, an unchristian one, I found out that these workshops were set up in those areas where there were women who were prostitutes, the immoral women. And it was easy to find them because they walked in those places where they could be hooked up. These women suffered because they had no other way to earn money in their life. Now they could get on a completely different way. They were saved. The aristocrats, Pashkov in particular, also visited prisons and hospitals. He didn't just share the gospel at the meetings in St. Petersburg, in various circles of people. He realized that in order to reach a bigger audience, they needed to establish a publishing house. He would publish edifying literature, Orthodox literature. He would translate and publish foreign articles about the salvation through faith. To help him, Paker would issue a magazine, The Russian Worker, where she would publish the literature translated for the common people at their level. And she would cooperate with Leskov, who in the beginning criticized their activity but later supported them. Trepov, the mayor of St. Petersburg, was a famous name. It was the time when terror was expanding by the members of the People's Will movement. And Trepov assumed that the evangelical movement could improve the situation. He is believed to say, if the venture of Pashkov wins, then we're saved. He meant social life. With help of the publishing house, Pashkov established connections with many regions of our country. It spread quickly and powerfully, like wildfire. In spring of 1880, during Easter, the house of Pashkov hosted the total of 1,500 people for a Sunday service. The chief prosecutor of the synod, Pobyedonoscev, attended one of the services. He was a very peculiar and dreadful individual, a Russian legislator, a conservative statesman, a church scholar, operating privy councillor. Konstantin Petrovich Pobyedonoscev was the main ideologue of the counter-reforms of Alexander III. From 1880 to 1905, he held the office of the chief prosecutor of the Holy Synod. He visited that specific service and was astonished by the scope and success of Pashkov's message. Therefore, almost immediately, a high-ranking committee was formed which prohibited such meetings. As of that time, the services could only be held secretly in private homes. The ban for the open meetings forced the aristocrats to leave the city to reside in their estates. Thus the new movement spread beyond St. Petersburg into villages, counties, and provinces. The news of the followers of Pashkov spread all over Russia. At one of Pashkov's estates there was a gardener named Kirpichnikov. He was a non-believer whose wife was severely ill and mentally disturbed. She was demon-possessed and threw herself on the ground, tried to harm herself and screamed with a wild voice. So he brought her to Pashkov. And this little book describes how Pashkov and his family gathered around a demon-possessed woman and prayed over her all night. She was trying to escape, threw herself upon them with foam on her mouth, but they were relentlessly praying. At one point she made her last scream, was covered in sweat, and fell unconscious. When she regained consciousness, she reconciled with the Lord and became his devout servant. Her husband Kirpichnikov, who was astonished, also came to faith. Later, Kargil was telling his story while visiting prisons in Siberia. He knew that Kirpichnikov and his wife were exiled to Minusинsk, and they were the light in Siberia, in Minusинsk. Later they kept transferring Kirpichnikov from one prison to another, as no one wanted to have this heretic around. They would transfer him to another town, but he would still preach and teach and work with children. In spring of 1884, Pashkov and Korf sent out an invitation to all evangelical believers to come to St. Petersburg on April 1st in order to get united in their joint actions for the cause of Christ. This was the time of revival in Russia. It spread to Caucasus, Ukraine, Belarus, and Central Russia. St. Petersburg was at the forefront of it all. About 70 to 100 delegates from different regions attended this convention. Among them were Stundists, Baptists, and Molokans. The convention we're talking about was number 0. It never had a chance to become the first one in history, as it didn't go to the end. But the convention lasted for one day, and it was crucial. On the day when all the delegates gathered together, they brought up the issue of women's ministry in church and in Christian world in general. As strange as it may seem to us, they managed to decide on that day that women, equally to men, may minister in church. The following night and early in the morning, some were arrested, some were provided with tickets and sent back, and thus the convention was closed. The Synod took note of this fact and purposed to break the backbone of Russian baptism, Stundism and Redstockism. Korf, Pashkov, Bobrinsky, all of them had to leave Russia. The deportation of these high-ranking officials caused a great shock. No one could ever think that the people who are personally acquainted with the emperor and his family could be so seriously punished. For example, here is one of the quotes of Pobedonoscev. The quick growth of these sects is extremely dangerous for the state. Let these sectarians be prohibited to leave their cities and villages. Let these criminals who violate faith be judged not by secular, but by spiritual authorities. Let their passports be stamped so that they could not get either hired or protected, so that their very presence in Russia could become impossible. Let the law prohibit them to buy, to sell, and to have property. Let their children be taken away from them and be brought up in the Orthodox faith. God-damned Stundists. All the evangelical movements were classified by the government with the term sect. There was only one state church at that moment, the Russian Orthodox Church. It was considered to have the fullness of truth. Therefore, the sectarians were those who cut themselves off of what was right. Stundists were actually the Russian Orthodox believers who had left the Russian Orthodox Church, but they didn't leave voluntarily. There are many testimonies that being part of the Russian Orthodox Church, they wanted to read the scriptures. That's what they were guilty of. The Word of God is described as something amazing and sharp. It divides the soul and the spirit and penetrates inside. The Bible was feared and concealed from people, lest they know it. One priest worded it this way: a closer look at the history of an advancement of this heresy had led me to the conviction that literacy is what provides a foundation and power for it. Priest Ushinsky wrote, "When listening to the arguments of the Stundists, I was surprised that some of them had managed, in a short time, to learn how to read, self-taught, without going to school. They diligently read the Bible in a Russian translation. Those who know Stundists have testified that they were honest, sober, clever, hardworking, and advanced people among Christians. One must be extremely angry with them to treat those people with contempt, who were always busy working and devoted their time to learning and reading the Bible." The same priest Ushinsky also beautifully noted, "The most mysterious for me was the moral turning point in the understanding and lifestyle of the deceived peasants, that all of a sudden they gave up on such popular common custom as drinking. Believers and their families were exiled to Caucasus and Siberia, which caused them many hardships, but also helped spread the gospel.
Но в то же время помогало распространяться евангельской вере, потому что там
This was how churches were planted in Siberia because believers were exiled there. They formed groups of 2 or 3 and the community grew. I would like to share with you about the suffering of regular people, regular believers. Their sufferings are reflected in the letters they wrote to Pashkov and Bonj-Bruyevich. Those letters reached the free press overseas later on. Our dear beloved brothers, we are reporting to you about the matters here. The foremen of the province and the village constable, along with all such drunkards, torture us mercilessly. It is terrible to express. They ripped a scarf of a woman's head and laid her down. First the drunk ones raped her, and the 4 men did the same after them. Then they forced her to cross herself, otherwise they would rape her again. They tormented the poor woman while she was pregnant. They twisted her arms, tore her whole body and left her to die. She is now at the point of death. They smashed everything we had in our huts, All of them are without windows now. We tearfully beg you, brothers, to speak on our behalf. You might find a way to file a petition because we cannot do it. They keep an eye on us day and night, lest we complain about it to any authorities. They wanted to keep it secret, so that no one would know what was happening. But through God's providence, the whole world learned about it and read about this abuse. It seemed like spiritual darkness came over Russia. While the official church was fighting nonconformity, people were devoured by pessimism. The intellectuals, students, professors, all of them could serve for the benefit of Russia. But having lost their purpose in life, they chose despair and death. And only a miracle saved the future spiritual leader of the Russian Evangelical Christians, Ivan Prokhanov, from the same destiny. It was the time of a desperate search for God and reckless battle between faith and unbelief. At the school he attended, suicidal dreams were quite popular. This life is hopeless anyway. It won't get better. Why live then? They were utterly pessimistic ideas. We read some of those stories in a little book by Vera Shelpyakova called "Don't Be Afraid, Just Believe," in which she tells about her experience at the university. Right in front of her eyes, a beautiful female student committed suicide and enticed her boyfriend to do the same. That's the power of a printed pessimistic word. Prokhanov gave weight to it and also had suicidal thoughts. The son of believing parents, one night he snuck into his father's office through the window. He knew that there was a gun on the wall above the bed, so he snuck in to get it. But his father had apparently perceived his thoughts, and the gun wasn't there. But there was a note on the table. "Do you love Jesus?" His heart broke. He knelt down and praised God for saving him from death and for his love, because he realized that it was God who saved him. The young man clearly saw a higher purpose in front of him. The merging of the ideals of the gospel and Christianity and of practical works. The inner voice was persistently calling him to go to the capital city and enter the Institute of Technology. Having passed serious exams, Ivan Prokhanov became a student. In the next 5 years, he combined study of engineering and organization of underground meetings and preaching. He would also be the first one to publish the Evangelical magazine, the first publication that united all, especially persecuted believers. The editorial board members came from various religious movements who wanted to work together. This young man's main ideas of activity were already formed then. He was interested in publishing, in working together with different denominations, and he was able to unite people for a common cause. The police were able to seize the publications, but they were not able to seize all of them. That's why when this literature got into the hands of the exiled in Transcaucasia, everyone read it and much hardened up. In 1901, there was an economic relief, enabling people to start their own businesses. So everyone started making money, including the Ministry of the Interior. The ministry allowed to publish any type of literature unrelated to internal affairs on a commercial basis. To seize this opportunity, Prokhanov took his first hymnal to the ministry's publishing house. When he was asked whether the book contained anything revolutionary, he replied, "Oh no, it's all about love." So the hymnal was published. And when it went on sale, and someone read it and saw that it was neither a Russian Orthodox nor a love piece, but Protestant evangelical literature, they made a fuss. The order was to confiscate it, but it was too late. Everything has already been distributed. When they wanted to expropriate the book from believers, they saw that it had been printed by the Ministry of the Interior, and everyone was shocked that the ministry was publishing evangelical poetry. According to Prokhanov's recollections, services were taking place in attics or basements. People were coming one by one. As for singing, they either didn't sing at all in order not to get exposed, or they sang in a very low voice. In the summer, they were gathering together in groves and forests around St. Petersburg, because the police were watching to make sure that Christians wouldn't gather together, even in groups of 5 people. Nevertheless, brutal persecution of any kind of dissidents didn't save Russia from another upheaval. A set of various circumstances led the empire to the First Russian Revolution. It began with a violent execution of unarmed workers who were protesting on January 9, 1905. The Bloody Sunday was followed by numerous strikes, revolts, and protests. Aggression and violence swept through the country. To stop the upheaval, Nicholas II issued a number of crucial liberal decrees which culminated in a prototype of a constitution. The imperial proclamation of October 17th granted civil liberties to the citizens of the Russian Empire. People welcomed it with tears on their eyes because the whole country had already been exhausted from religious persecutions. Proclamation of the freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and union. The state has no right to dictate how a person should believe. In 1905, Prokhanov already had several co-workers and decided to send a couple of them to study in London, to learn from Spurgeon. It was a school, or at least an opportunity to learn from the king of preachers, as they called him in those days. He was a very successful man in the Christian world and a very powerful speaker. Since he had a school, somebody from St. Petersburg could be sent to study there. One of them was Alexander Ivanovich Ivanov. Alexander Ivanov was one of the founding fathers of the Church of Evangelical Christians in the spirit of the Apostles. He was born in 1880. At the age of 25, he went to study at the London Bible College. After the Revolution, he preached a lot in Russia, and he was arrested twice because of that. In 1909, Prokhanov sent Ivanov to Finland to work at an affiliated church. But Ivanov didn't go there by himself, but with 2 assistants, Nikolai Petrovich Smorodin and Vasily Artemyevich Sukharukov, who were the founding fathers of the church where we minister today. Nikolai Smorodin was born in 1875 in St. Petersburg province in the family of a fisherman. He served in the Tsar army and the shore troops of the navy in the city of Abo or Turku. During the Soviet times, he was arrested for preaching the Word of God more than once. He died in 1953 in prison. Later, he was rehabilitated, post-mortem. Speaking of Smorodin, his further activity involved spreading the gospel outside of St. Petersburg. After leaving Finland, he was preaching the gospel in Central Russia and today's Belarus. Everywhere he went, there were mass healings, deliverance, and prophecies. Clementi Yakovlevich Shatrov was my father's uncle. He was one of the first people to receive Jesus Christ as his personal Savior and Lord of his life. In his young age, he was involved in revolutionary activities. He was bringing literature from St. Petersburg to Vyborg. It was Bolshevik literature, of course. One day when he came to St. Petersburg to pick up the literature, he was late for his train because the bridges had been drawn. So he couldn't make it on time to the Finlandsky train station. So he spent the whole night walking down the streets, and he noticed that people were entering one of the buildings. He decided to find out where they were going. It was a meeting of evangelical believers. He decided to go in and listen, saying to himself on the way, "I'll still have a chance to listen to Lenin, but I may not get a chance to listen to the believers again." So he chose to spend the night at their meeting. They were gathering at night because their meetings were illegal. So he was sitting and listening without seemingly feeling anything in particular. So he wasn't touched by what people were saying till he said, "Lord, if you really exist, I want to know you." At that moment, something happened to him. He started crying and experiencing supernatural things. He became a new person. He said that at that very moment he indeed met with Jesus Christ. He went back to Vyborg only to say that he was no longer going to continue the Bolshevik activity. Then he went back to his homeland where 3 of his brothers received Christ: Clementi Yakovlevich, Leonti Yakovlevich, and Timofey Yakovlevich. 3 brothers, one of them was my grandfather. And so this big family, each of them had 7 children, believed and became Christians. Thus my father was born in a Christian home. In 1915, Andrei Urshan, a missionary from Iran, came to Russia to preach the baptism in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. For the first time, 16 believers were baptized the way the apostles did it in the Gospels, by complete immersion of the person into the water as a sign of abandoning the old way of living. The first baptism of this kind took place at the Black River on April 23, 1916, on Easter Day. It was considered the beginning of the Church of Evangelical Christians in the spirit of the apostles that we are part of today. In 1917, the October coup was the event that influenced the course of history, both in Russia and worldwide. The world will never be the same. The old life is gone. The new one is only promised. It was far from being welcomed by all. Many people left the country for good. Others preferred to stay, no matter what. Alexander Ivanovich stayed in St. Petersburg. He had a parishioner named Fadeev who used to be involved with Lenin since he belonged to the workers' movement. So Fadeev came to Lenin and asked him to sign a permit for building a church, and Lenin signed the paper. The church was not built in St. Petersburg, but in the village of Gribovo. Vasily Artemyevich Sukharukov was the one who eventually headed the church after he had returned from Finland. So he went to Gribovo. It was the biggest congregation, the biggest church, because people from several villages attended services there. Both my mother and my father spent the years of their youth at that congregation.
в этих служениях и в этих общениях.
Vasily Artemyevich Sukharukov.
Vasily Artemyevich Sukharukov was born in 1891 and was anointed for ministry by Alexander Ivanovich Ivanov and Nikolai Petrovich Smorodin. He was a missionary in Finland till 1917. Then he returned to Russia. In 1937 he was convicted under Article 58 for the first time. He spent a total of 17 years in Stalin's prisons and camps. The 1930s were the capstone of his ministry. As such, he was subject to persecution. He served a 10-year term in prison in the Kolyma area. When he was returning, his boat collided with an iceberg. The situation resembled that of Titanic, but their boat was obviously smaller, so it started sinking very quickly. People in the lower hold were former prisoners. There were quite many of them, and no one was going to care much about them. They realized that they were virtually buried. So in that very hold he said, "Lord, have I suffered torment in prison for 10 years to become food for fish now?" And suddenly, at this moment, the boat stopped sinking, already broken and banked. It remained like this for several hours until a rescue boat came to their SOS signal. Every single person managed to transfer to the rescue boat. The captain was leaving last. The moment he stepped aboard the rescue boat, the sinking ship went underwater within a few minutes or even seconds. Watching the boat that had been waiting for the rescue boat for several hours, the captain, all pale, said, "There is a man of God among us. Such things can't happen on their own." My great-grandfather, who was one of the last to leave the sinking ship, personally heard the captain saying those words. But my grandfather didn't stay free a long time. While he was absent, there grew a need for the ministry of baptism. So people in the villages where he used to serve were waiting for his return to get baptized. Many people had repented and had been waiting for someone to baptize them. But it was a severe winter, and he had returned from prison sick with scurvy. While he had ailments all over his body and was weak, he couldn't refuse to baptize the people. And he said, "Go make an ice hole." So the men of the village, who were also weak, went to make an ice hole. When they made it, they saw that it was quite deep. They checked the depth with a stick and realized that my great-grandfather, who wasn't a tall man, would not be able to stand there. They made another ice hole closer to the river bank, but it was deep again. Seeing how tired the men were, my great-grandfather said, "Keep cutting the ice here. My God is mighty to hold me in the water." When he went into the water to baptize, there were dozens of people, and he had to stay in the ice-cold water all the time. While he was baptizing, all the people in the village saw how angels were standing around the ice hole and throwing fiery stones into the water. After the baptism, no one got sick. In fact, all those who were sick got healed. And my great-grandfather never had a tooth pain ever since. His scurvy and cold were completely gone. He didn't have either fever or weakness anymore. He was completely restored. But after the baptism, he was imprisoned again. He was sentenced for another 10 years. The Soviet government revealed its atheistic nature rather soon. Repressive legislation was already in effect by 1929. The notorious law on religious worship was repealed only in 1990. In the 1930s, many members of the community were repressed and the church was officially closed. People started gathering in small groups. When they were gathering illegally to keep up their fire, then all of a sudden in 1938 they were suggested to get the congregation registered again. People believed that it was another chance for them to regain the good attitude they had not so long ago. So they submitted a list of names for the registration. The following night, everyone on the list was arrested. Tertullian, one of the fathers of the early church, said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The goal of the Soviet government was to destroy the church, even physically, and the government was doing it very aggressively. But the church life rose up on the blood of the martyrs. In 1941, the blockade of St. Petersburg began. Repression stopped because there were other goals during the war. But that period helped to preserve the remnant of the church. During the blockade, people witnessed amazing miracles of God. One of the monumental people for me is Marina Sergeyevna, who survived the blockade. She was one of the first original members of the church. I personally knew her when I was a child. She used to share stories which were incredible from a human point of view. For example, she fell ill with dropsy, and she was alone in a cold room. Lying in her bed, she said to God, "Lord, I will die of hunger here now." The Lord said to her, "I'll send you an angel." So she was lying there all night, staring at the ceiling, afraid to fall asleep because she might miss an angel. She wanted to see him very much. In the morning, when the curfew was over, she heard someone knocking. She invited the visitor to come in. It was a woman, one of the church members. With a hint of indignation, Marina Sergeyevna said, "I've been waiting for an angel, but it's just you." She was a straightforward person. The woman said, "The Lord didn't let me fall asleep all night," and said, "Take some food to Maria." Even during the hardest period of 1941, 42, and 43, the church never stopped gathering together. It wasn't on a city-wide, but on a local level. Believers gathered in small groups and prayed for victory, for the preaching to continue, and for the revival of the church. The blockade continued, and people had to survive somehow. Maria wasn't married, but she had relatives. Her sister had children. So they decided to ask God, "Lord, can we get evacuated? Should we leave this place, or will you preserve us here?" God replied to her, "Yes, you need to leave." "Lord, is it dangerous for us to leave now?" And she heard these words, "When you go, not a single dog will move its tongue, not a single bird will flap its wings. That's how quiet it will be." So they loaded all their belongings in a truck and left. Before their departure, there were several bombings that destroyed other trucks. But when their truck started off, it was dead quiet all the way around them. Nobody even wanted to talk because of the quiet that hadn't been heard for a long time. As soon as they left the area, bombing resumed. Next, they got on a train, but they didn't know where to go. They started asking God, "Lord, where should we get off? Where would it be better for us to live?" And they heard the word, Akatyevo. She said, "I heard the word Akatyevo, and I saw a house on a hill." There were 2 pine trees next to the house, and she saw a woman coming out who was carrying bread and a watermelon. She cut the watermelon in half, she gave one half to us, and she kept the other half to herself, and she also broke the bread. Having seen this vision, Maria said, I realized that we had to go to Akatyevo. I don't know if there will be this house and the woman, but at least I'll be able to recognize the place. So they got on the train. They traveled 1 day, then 2, then 3. They seemed to have traveled pretty far, but they didn't know where Akatyevo was located. They hadn't heard of that station before, and it wasn't in the schedule. They asked around, but no one could tell. So they kept going, and they traveled a few more days. Then all of a sudden, at one of the stations, a coachman came in and shouted, "Who's going to Akatyevo?" The stop wasn't long, so they gathered their belongings quickly and loaded them on his cart. As they approached Akatyevo, she saw from afar a house on a hill with 2 pine trees. As the cart came closer to the house, a woman came out of it, carrying a watermelon and a loaf of bread. She divided them and gave them one part. Then she invited them into the house, saying, "Your family will stay here while you're here. We're ready to help you with everything you need." They were shown such hospitality. Thus, they ended up in the Altai region. During the war, Stalin liberalized his policy towards the church. And in 1944, those evangelical Christians and Baptists who remained alive were allowed to register an integrated union of evangelical Christian Baptists. During the difficult post-war years, despite the continued persecution, the church started coming back to life. In 1953, Dmitry Leontievich Shatrov came to Leningrad. He was a young man whose life had dramatically changed when he was 7 years old. One day when he was in a field, far from people, he was tending sheep. He suddenly felt that something was approaching from the sky. It was like a cloud that descended unto him. And he heard a voice, "I'm calling you to a large ministry. You will serve in my kingdom. You will serve my children." He was completely perplexed. He didn't know when and where it would happen. He was only 7. The anointing that came in that cloud had a very peculiar smell. When he came home, that smell accompanied him for a few days. His mother smelled that unusual smell too. It related to something supernatural. My grandmother on the father's side, named Olympiada, had a gift of prophecy. She was a strong prayer warrior and intercessor. So when her son was far from home and had that encounter, she was at home, and she heard the Lord saying to her, "I've called your son for ministry." I should mention that when my father was born, he was on the brink of death. Something was wrong with his skull. They had to bind his head up with a towel to keep it together. His skull bones had not grown together, or maybe it was a birth injury. He didn't know. He simply knew about the fact that he was dying. But he miraculously survived. Thus the Lord reminded his mother that he had kept him alive and given him a big calling, and that he would go to a different city. And so the time came when in 1953 he heard this word, "You need to go to Leningrad. Your calling is waiting for you there." Can you imagine the years of 1952 and 1953? Stalin's repression. My mom and dad were 16 and 22 years old, respectively. Even before they got married, they had received a prophecy that they would live in a big city and that they would host foreigners in their home. It was terrifying to hear. One night, Dad had an interesting dream. In a dream, he was told to harness himself instead of a horse to pull a huge cart. He looked at it and said, "I can't." He heard again, "Harness yourself." So he came up to the cart and harnessed himself. There was a huge load in it. He could hardly imagine that he would be able to pull it, but when he tried pulling, it moved easily. And he thought to himself, "It's impossible for me, a human being, to move such a huge load so easily." But when he turned around, he saw a hand from heaven pushing the cart. So he realized that he was offered to pull the big load, which God would help him to pull. In 1972, Dmitry Shatrov was ordained for ministry and became one of those who ensured official registration of the Evangelical Church in Leningrad during the Soviet times. Despite 100 years of persecution and incalculable suffering of all the evangelical Christians in Russia, the Church revived. Owing to those who had paid a great price, who didn't give up, and who had endured, the work of Christ continues today. This is because the hearts of those people were filled with living faith and love, and no one has been able to break them down. When Jesus prayed in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, he said, "I have finished the work that you have given me to do." He was about to face the Calvary. What kind of work was he talking about? In his prayer, he prayed about his disciples and followers. It was important to him that the work that he had begun wouldn't stop or die out. He wanted his followers to be faithful, strong, and united. It was important back then, and it's still important today. Jesus even prayed about us in that prayer, saying, "May those who believe through the words of these disciples be preserved and be one." We are the result of that prayer. When we look back at the generations that passed this faith to us, it's important not only to know the roots, but also to understand continuity. The thing is that any work that God gives to man to do on earth is for more than one generation. It is a long trail of moral, will, and purpose, taking continuity into account. In the past, our forefathers received this task for St. Petersburg and for Russia. I remember how those elderly women whom I've already mentioned came to our house to pray for the city. It's been 15 years now since we began night prayers for the city. We only continue what they used to do. That's why it's important and precious to me that their work hasn't been forgotten. The price they paid, their life, experience, and acts of bravery can strengthen us today so that we could finish our part in a worthy manner.